It was a crisp fall morning in Pennsylvania, and flags swayed gently in the breeze as President Donald Trump arrived at a small-town Veterans Appreciation event. The crowd cheered, waving signs and wearing hopeful expressions. Among them stood a quiet woman named Margaret Hale, modestly dressed and holding a small wooden box wrapped in a faded American flag. In her early 50s, Margaret wasn't one to seek attention, but today was different. She had traveled nearly 300 miles for this moment. Her son, Private First Class Daniel Hale, had served in Afghanistan and never made it home. Years of grief had weighed heavily on her, till one evening she discovered something in Daniel's old footlocker that gave her purpose again. As President Trump approached the podium and security scanned the crowd, Margaret stepped forward and softly called, "Out, Mr. President." He paused. Spotting her near the front, something in her presence made him stop mid-step. The Secret Service shifted cautiously, but Margaret simply raised the box and spoke gently. "Please, just open this when you're alone." There was no anger in her voice, only quiet sincerity. Trump studied her for a moment, then gave a nod and took the box. The event moved on, but that brief exchange lingered in the air. People noticed. Margaret slipped back into the crowd without another word. Later that evening aboard Air Force One, Trump sat in silence with the box in his lap. While his advisors talked around him, he quietly unwrapped the faded flag. It could possibly be inside that moved a grieving mother to approach the president with such hope. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay two things: a worn military medal and a folded letter. Trump touched the medal first, a bronze star. Engraved on the back, PFC Daniel Hale, honor through sacrifice. Then he opened the letter. "Dear Mr. President," it began, "if you're reading this, it means my mother had the courage to do what I couldn't. My name is Daniel Hale. I served in Afghanistan. I was 19 when I enlisted, full of dreams, fear, and pride. I never made it home. But I wrote this in hopes you'd understand what this medal really means, not just for me, but for all of us who never got to tell our stories." Trump leaned back, stunned. Daniel's handwriting was unsteady, but filled with heart. The letter continued. "This box isn't just a gift, it's a message." The letter read, "When I hope can change something, 'cause soldiers like me don't die for medals. We die hoping we mattered, hoping someone remembers, hoping someone listens." For the first time in a long while, President Trump sat in complete silence as the hum of Air Force One faded around him. He folded the letter, stared at the medal, and felt its true weight more than brass. It carried meaning. He quietly turned to an aide and said, "Find out everything about Margaret Hale." Meanwhile, back in her small Lancaster County home, Margaret returned without expecting a response. She didn't seek praise, just a quiet hope that someone might feel her son's presence one more time. Daniel's photo still hung in the living room, bright eyes, lopsided smile, forever in uniform. Her neighbor Linda knocked softly. "Did he take it?" Margaret nodded. "You think he'll read it?" Staring at the empty chair where Daniel once sat, Margaret answered, "I think he already has." That night, Margaret placed a candle. In the window, a quiet family tradition, a symbol of waiting. Though Daniel wouldn't return, the flame stayed lit, a soft vigil for something greater. In Washington, President Trump sat at the resolute desk, Daniel's letter beside him. He read it over and over until he whispered, "This can't just be a letter." 3 days later, while Margaret was baking cornbread, a convoy pulled into her gravel driveway. She stepped onto the porch and froze as Secret Service agents appeared, followed by the thumping blades of Marine One, and then President Trump stepping out in a dark suit. Her breath caught as he approached the steps and asked gently, "May I come in?" Inside, Trump sat at Daniel's old kitchen table, the candle still flickering in the window. "I read the letter," he said, 3 times. It left me speechless. Margaret stayed quiet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the medal. "Your son," he mattered. "He still does. I don't think this belongs in a drawer." He placed it gently on the table. "I want to share his words, but I need your blessing." When she asked why he cared so much, Trump glanced around the modest home, then back at her and said, "Because this box reminded me what real leadership means, listening to the quiet voices and honoring them." A week later, During a nationally televised Veterans Day ceremony, Trump stood before a crowd of veterans and families. Holding the letter, he said, "This was given to me in a small box by a mother. Her son, Private First Class Daniel Hale, didn't come home, but he left behind a message." As Trump began reading Daniel's words, the venue fell silent. Some wept, others stood with hands over hearts. By the end, his voice cracked. "Daniel," he said softly, "we remember. We're listening now." Asterisk, the speech went viral within hours. Millions watched, memorials were visited. And across the country, people asked, who was Daniel Hale? At home, Margaret sat on her couch, hands trembling, the candle still burning, as her son's voice was finally heard. After the broadcast, the White House mailroom was flooded with thousands of letters from veterans, military families, and civilians. Many included photos, medals, and deeply personal stories. One message echoed through them all. Daniel gave us the courage to speak. Moved, President Trump ordered a special team to archive every submission, saying, "No voice goes unheard." Margaret was invited to join the initiative, and though she hesitated at first, a letter from a young Marine sister changed everything. "Your son's letter gave me hope. I thought no one cared. Thank you." Margaret folded it beside Daniel's hands, steady now, and packed her bags for Washington. Inside the East Wing of the White House, a new tribute took shape. The wall of quiet heroes, filled with stories, letters, journals, and recordings from fallen soldiers and their families. At the center stood Daniel's box. During the opening ceremony, Margaret stood beside it as President Trump addressed the crowd. "These men and women didn't just wear the uniform, they left behind legacies. We're here to make sure the world never forgets." Cameras clicked, but the image that moved the nation most was of Margaret touching her son's medal, tears falling gently beneath a plaque that read, "Honor through Sacrifice, the Daniel Hale Memorial Project." Back in Pennsylvania, Daniel's former high school hosted a special assembly. Students sat quietly as Daniel's story was shared, a boy in the back. Jason raised his hand. He was only 19, like our age. The principal nodded yes. And his message was that everyone, no matter how quiet, has a story worth hearing that night. Jason went home and apologized to his brother, a Marine he used to fight. With the ripple continued, one voice, one letter, one box. As the memorial gained attention, some political critics called it a publicity stunt. News outlets debated its authenticity. Margaret was asked to speak, but instead of arguing, she held up Daniel's original letter and said simply, "My son didn't write this for the cameras, he wrote it in case he never came home." And he didn't, but now his words are saving lives. Silence fell in the room, and across the nation, people began to listen again. One night alone in the Oval Office, Trump looked at Daniel's photo. He whispered, "You made me remember why I wanted this." Job. For the first time in years, he penned a personal note, not a tweet, not a speech. It read, "Dear Daniel, you made me a better leader. Thank you, Donald J. Trump." He placed it in the same wooden box and locked it in the presidential archive. A Vietnam veteran named Carl visited the memorial. He hadn't spoken about his service in 40 years. He stared at Daniel's box for over an hour. Finally, he whispered to the guide, "I think I'd like to tell my story." Carl's story became the first addition to the Wall of Quiet Heroes. And by the end of that week, 46 more veterans had shared their own. Margaret never returned to Lancaster. Instead, she traveled to schools, veteran centers, and public events reading Daniel's letter. People hugged her, wept, and listened. A documentary crew began following her journey, calling it the box that spoke. At every stop, Margaret lit a single candle. One day, a 7-year-old girl named Emily sent a drawing to the White House. It showed a soldier hugging his mom with the words, "He mattered." The picture went viral. Trump had it framed and placed next to Daniel's box. "Even a child," he said during a press conference, "understands what we sometimes forget." In Florida, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lane, widowed by the Korean War and childless, saw Margaret's story and mailed her husband's story and dog tag to the White House. Margaret visited her personally. They cried together, two mothers from different eras, united in quiet grief and love. During a heated budget debate, a freshman senator cited Daniel's letter, "We spend billions but forget our quiet heroes. Let this boy's voice guide us." The chamber fell silent, and for once both sides agreed. The bill passed, expanding support for families of the fallen. The Smithsonian asked to display Daniel's box, and Margaret agreed on one condition: every story inspired by his had to be included. The exhibit was named "The Letter That Changed a Nation." On Memorial Day, a nationwide candlelight vigil was held. Millions lit candles. On the White House lawn, Trump stood beside Margaret. No speeches, no press, just silence for Daniel and all who served. Days later, she received a package, a gold plaque engraved "Margaret Hale, the mother who made us listen," signed by every living president. As Trump's term ended, his final televised message wasn't political. Holding Daniel's letter, he said, "If I leave you with one thing, let it be this: never ignore the quiet voices. They often hold the deepest truths." Years later, Margaret sat in her rocking chair, older but steady. Outside her window, the candles still burned. A young reporter asked, "Do you think your son ever imagined this?" She smiled, eyes wet with pride, and softly replied, "I think he hoped